Hello, book lovers! I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. Check This Out is a series where I interview emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. A series brought to you by New Hampshire Public Radio and the Penn-Faulkner Foundation. Penn-Faulkner administers major literary awards and public programs, including the Penn-Faulkner Award for Fiction. We have a lot of really exciting books and authors coming your way this season. Next week, I talk to Emma Patty, author of Tilt. Tune in next week for that interview. Today on the show, my guest is Jemima Way, and we are discussing her brand new debut novel, The Original Daughter. The Original Daughter transports us to 2015, to Singapore. The novel opens with a mother on her deathbed, with one daughter next to her asking to speak to the other. From there, we jump back to 1996 and learn about the sisters. We discover the girls are only a year apart and no longer speaking. And we discover that Erin was brought into their lives when she was 7 years old as the product of her grandfather's secret life in Malaysia. Erin disrupts everything in Genevieve's life, in good ways and in bad ways. We learn about how the girls learn to love each other and depend on each other. As they grow up, money is tight, desperation is high. They work hard for a way out together until their futures diverge. Genevieve cracks under the weight and pressure of the Singaporean educational system, while Erin soars. In the end, one sister betrays the other in order to get ahead. Or does she? There are no clear answers, no clear rights or wrongs in this novel, and that is its biggest strength. Similarly, the girls love each other as much as they resent each other, and I felt the same. I followed their emotions, their highs and lows, and could never quite decide who had made the right decision and who hadn't. And I think that's really the point of this novel. It's what I can't wait to discuss with my guest today, Jemima Way. Jemima, I'm thrilled to have you here on my show. Check this out. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. And what a lovely introduction. I was so moved. Thank you so much for reading it so deeply.
Jemima, your debut novel, The Original Daughter, is about two sisters living in Singapore. And it's really easy to say that this book is about them growing up in a deep betrayal. But I actually don't think there's anything easy about this book. And so I want to ask you, when people ask you, what is your book about? How do you answer that? What do you say?
Then it depends on who I'm talking to. I've always thought about this book as a love story ever since I started writing it. I was like, it's gonna be a love story, but it's gonna be an unromantic love story. I grew up in Singapore. Media is very saturated with all kinds of love stories. And while I loved a good Taiwanese drama like The Next Person, I just kind of feel like there is this hierarchy of romance in the relationships that are put out to us. And for women, or maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I think this is like generally true. A lot of our initial early stage intense relationships are with other women or with non-romantic people in our lives. And when romance shows up, it tends to be temporary because at 12 years old, like 15, you're having a crush that, sometimes it goes long, but those relationships, I wanted to show that platonic relationships that are so strong don't seed that easily to romance. And that was one of the big things through the book. How do I write a love story that's unromantic? And in your introduction, you talked about how they love and resent each other equally. And I think that is something that I worked with for years and years and years and years as I was working in this book.
Love and resentment, they're intertwined for these sisters. And it's really a thread that kept me reading. And I was never sure which edge we were on. But their love was so deep that I trusted they would just always come back together.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I hope so.
Jemima Way, would you read for us from your beautiful debut, The Original Daughter? And I just want to mention you are in New York City, and I can hear the background, I hear the noises, and I love it.
Oh yeah, I hear those noises every day. It's become like brown noise to me right now. Okay, I think I would just read from the start. Okay, so this is prologue, the end, May 2015, Singapore, chapter 1. Aaron was somewhere in Germany when my mother got sick again. She had been sick before, but never like this, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she would change her mind and start asking for Aaron. The prospect filled me with dread. My sister and I hadn't spoken for years, not since she first got famous, not even when my mother was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer a couple of years ago. Back then, too, I had been afraid that if things got really bad, my mother would want Aaron there. But we had had her breasts lopped off, one after the other, and appeared to have stopped the cancer spread. The subject of Aaron never came up. Our relationship hadn't been good for a long time. And in recent years, my mother's irreverence had dampened into a more respectable muteness. But after she recovered, my mother immediately became irritating again. She had lost so much weight from the chemotherapy. It didn't seem to matter that she had no breasts. She sheared off her fluffy black hair, wore nothing but singlets and shorts, and gleefully told everybody passing by the photocopy shop that between this and menopause, she was finally relieved of the trappings of being a woman. The word she used, one I caught her selecting carefully from the Oxford English Dictionary by our sole electric nightlight, was liberation. Liberation! And when had she not acted exactly as she pleased? I felt that she was baiting me. I refused to respond. Then a few days ago, I woke to find my mother still in bed beside me, one arm thrown over her face. Ma, I said, it's 8. She was usually out of the house by 6, either at the wet market or doing exercises at Bedok Reservoir Park with her Tai Chi group before opening the photocopy shop. To her, sleeping in was something only rich people did, a sign of weak character. My mother peeked at me from under her arm and didn't say a word. Rare for her to forgo a chance to tease. I put my face to her wrist, her neck, sniffing. When I clambered over her body and saw the milky splat of vomit on the floor, she hid her face again. Get dressed, I said after a long moment. I'm calling Dana.
A beautiful opening to your debut, The Original Daughter. Jemima, this book is set in Singapore. You grew up in Singapore. Are there pieces of your real life in Singapore in this novel?
Yes, but not in the way that people would think. So people would think like, oh, I'll correspond bits of my life to it. But for me, it was different. I was thinking, how could this book be a love letter to my life and everything that I do love? And so I very deliberately put in the names of things that I love, that I want to see immortalized in print, that doesn't make the primary narratives of media when they look at Singapore. I named the college after my husband because I was like, I love this man. I want to have his name in my book. I put in my friend's parents' noodle shop. I was like, these are things that I love. I want to see them. I want to see it in literature. I don't want to just hear about the glitzy hits from the media when I hear about Singapore. And I do think that if we don't write this into our own literary canon, our canon is going to be defined by what other people think of us, what other people see when they come to our country or step into our stories. And that's also valid. That is an experience of somebody who has a certain kind of interface with Singapore. But it was important to me to put very specific things in because I love them. I would love my friends. I love my family. I love our favorite noodle shop. I want it in the book, and I did. I did put it in.
So that's real. And the Singapore school system, you go into great depth about the testing, the rigor of that system. That is also very real and true to your experience.
Yeah, I would be pretty surprised if there was a Singaporean out there who felt that their schooling experience was chill. It's just, we are a really achievement oriented society. We're extremely pragmatic. And there is a sense, that you have to work really hard to make it. And I mean, you're constantly tested. I think they are trying to change that now. But growing up, it was certainly true that you're on this constant conveyor belt of tests. And it does feel like if you fall off the bandwagon, it's really, really hard to climb back on. I have seen people who have not survive the education system. They crack or they drop out or worse. And I do think that this is a conversation that's been coming up more and more in the last decade, like mental health and being able to like cope. And I think that the thing that we don't talk about is coping is an inherited skill. It's a learned skill. You learn to cope by watching the people around you cope. And that is a kind of soft skill that isn't equally afforded to everybody, I don't think.
So your two characters, Jen and Aaron, they really struggle through this school system. Money is very tight. They live in a one-room apartment, and they have this dream of getting out. And maybe it's through school, but maybe it's also through becoming YouTube hosts. And I understand that, like them, you were a host at Click Network. So can you talk about just this whole universe of becoming a host and how that's a way out of this school system and how that's in this novel?
Yeah, it's interesting because I grew up in a time where we were still flirting with the internet. It wasn't such an integrated part of our life. And then suddenly, all of a sudden, there was this huge shift, a huge acceleration in the way we spoke online and in the way we learned to present ourselves. And that coincided with kind of my own coming of age. And so In my personal experience, I was scouted at a pretty young age to do a reality TV show. And so I did that for many years. I did reality TV show. I did another one. I did travel shows for networks, both like regionally and locally. And I had a great time. Honestly, I feel like I was so lucky because I had very strong female mentors almost immediately. People took me under their wing. I felt very protected. And even then, it was challenging. But prior to that, everybody I knew was doing all kinds of odd jobs, trying to like really do well in school because that is the one piece of paper you have your qualification to go to the next stage. And suddenly there was this whole other path that opened up that seemed like such a different barrier to entry because you just need an internet connection and the willingness to yap nonstop, and somebody will listen. Like suddenly there was this whole new avenue of like meeting people, connecting with people. And it did feel like it was like a new frontier, right? Building this side of your life that then became commercialized and monetized that wasn't dependent on your qualifications, wasn't dependent on how well you did in school or your pedigree. It was just dependent on how good you were at yapping, right? And for me, it was so enjoyable. It did drastically change my personal finances. And that opened up so many opportunities for me. Growing up in the kind of family and background I grew up in, I there was no way I could have traveled the world, no way I could have saved up so much money to pursue my MFA. It's just not possible for me.
It was fascinating the way you wove this new opportunity, this reality show host into the book and into your characters. And I have to say, Jemima, that I've interviewed over 130 authors, and never once have I had a reality show host on. This is very exciting. I mean,
Oh gosh.
it's just very real, very new, and it's a way out that's not just school. But of course, layered on top of that is this pressure about image and what you're projecting and who you are. And especially as a woman, you want to have some control of who you are, but do you have control? And what are you showing the world? I think are the issues that you're grappling with. And you put that into the book so beautifully. Could you read for us so we can talk about that?
Sure. And for context, this is one of the characters has gone to audition for a show, and this is the producer talking to her. She had laughed. Only once, she was quick to clarify, because the idea of monetizing stress was funny, but I, unfortunately, was not. The problem was, she said, I was too self conscious, too desperate to be liked. It was obvious from the way I talked that I was mirroring behavior I had seen before, preempting positive reactions. I spoke not like someone blurting spontaneous thoughts, but like imagining what a person resembling me would say. The hardest thing, she concluded, is to be authentically yourself. Even if the part is a skit, a caricature, the audience has to feel the force of personality behind it. Most people can't do it. They are held captive by an image of themselves they want people to believe in. That's fine if you're just living a normal life, but in front of the camera, no. Humiliated, I asked, so everyone in your videos, they're all 100% like that in real life too? She paused. No. But if you can't tell they're putting on a show, then I've done my job well.
Jemima, that's so powerful. I love this sentence. Most people can't do it. They're held captive by an image of themselves they want people to believe in. And it seems like that is one of the big themes of your book.
Yeah, I do think that with these two characters specifically, they want to believe in a version of themselves that isn't quite aligned with their reality, right? And I think that is something that recurs throughout the book, where there's this pain of the alternate lives that you could have been living if things were just a little bit different. And and that vision of what things could have been, if you let it influence your life, it can exert great influence over the things that you do and the choices that you make, which is, I think, very interesting.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Jemima Way, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Jemima Way's brand new debut novel, The Original Daughter. So, Jemima, we're going to dig into the book itself. I love talking to you about your reality host career, but we're going to dig into these characters because I want to talk about them even more. Let's talk about Genevieve and Aaron. Can you introduce us to Genevieve?
Genevieve Young is the original daughter. She lives in this family, grows up very beloved, the only child, and even though times are difficult, and then at 8 years old, suddenly, out of the blue, her dead grandfather's secret family kind of like emerges from the unknown to deposit this terrified 7-year-old into their lives. And That's Erin, her sister. And Erin is somebody who I think has to learn really quickly how to adapt to these changing circumstances, even though this is not something any 7-year-old should go through. But this practice of children being given away or swapped is actually very common where I come from. And in my interpersonal relationships and extended family, I've seen it so many times. And so I was really interested in this idea of family, chosen family, returned family. And that is something I think plays throughout the book.
Can you tell us about Erin? And she comes from a sort of out of the blue from a secret family when she's 7 and Genevieve is 8. Can you tell us about that other family and how she came to be?
Genevieve, growing up, has had this narrative of her disappeared grandfather all along. One that her grandmother put forth because it's a story her grandmother needed to believe in order to stay sane, I guess. And then suddenly, this story is totally disproved by the appearance of another family. So he did not die as a war hero. He vanished because he had somebody else he cared more about. And so now, because of circumstances, he has passed. That family is like, we need to give this daughter a better life. They deposit this child into the family that we are introduced to at the start of the book. And that kicks off the events of the novel.
And when the sisters first meet, Genevieve and Erin, how do they feel about each other?
They're a little wary. One is 7 and one is 8, and they're like, "Who is this?" They're like sniffing around. And Genevieve, the protagonist, is really, she's somebody who really wants to do well at everything, including being there for her sister, her new sister, because her mom is like, This is a really difficult time for this poor girl. We have to try and be there for her." And she's like, "Yes, I will do that. This is a task I can accomplish." So then she kind of goes above and beyond to be like, "Come, let me welcome you into this house." And this poor Erin, this new girl, is like, "Who are you? Where am I?" And so they do have a bumpy start, but I think generally well intentioned. They want to be there for each other. They very quickly realize at that age, and this really pained me to write because I don't think children should have to grow up that quickly and so suddenly, but they very quickly realize that they are not really the like designers of their own life at that point. They are subject to the decisions of adults all around them. They're very quickly confronting the reality, which I think all children confront at some point, that you have no agency, but you desperately want it. You want to be in control of your life. And so in this situation, you realize that the people who love you are still enacting control over your lives, and they're like, we only have each other. And so they cling to each other as time goes on, thinking to themselves, it's me and you against the world. And that kind of extreme mentality or codependence also has its frictions and also has its costs as you get older and you start to develop individually and forming a version of yourself against another person.
And they make a contract with each other.
Uh-huh. That is really like a kind of a private joke for me because Singaporeans are really people-oriented, right? We got contracts for everything, we got rules for everything. And I was like, yeah, it would make sense that a really law-abiding Singaporean girl would be like, a contract is something you cannot deny. Here is a contract. We have signed it. It is done. Till death do us part. God bless. So
I mean, they carried around for years.
oh, yeah. But we do that, right? We keep things that are sentimental to us, even if our world is getting more and more pragmatic and efficient and things don't make sense. Our house is small, we got no space. We still keep the things that don't matter to anybody else except us.
Genevieve is very driven. She wants to do very well in school, and in the beginning, she does. And when Erin shows up, she looks up to her and she throws herself into school also, sort of following behind Jen, trying to do as well as her sister. They're very different, but very similar, and they're very, very bonded. Did you identify with one sister more than the other?
Yeah, no. The character I identify the most in this book is actually a side character. It's the photocopy auntie who hires the mom. I'm like, whoa, she's just there yapping, it's like having a good time, and then unfortunately causing drama. And I was like, oh yeah, I love this character. But again, because a book grows out of the vision of the author, I do feel very strongly for all the characters in this book. And for the two girls, I don't really feel like I identified with them so much as I feel like their mom. Like I feel like I really grew these two girls and I had to let them do their thing. Even when as I was writing, I was like, oh no, that's don't do that, don't do that. But you have to let them do what they want to do. And so it was a real exercise for me in letting go.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Jemima Way. We're talking about her brand new debut novel, The Original Daughter. Jemima, we've just been talking about the two main characters. They're sisters, Erin and Genevieve. and they are thrown together when they're 8 and 7, and they become very, very close. They're codependent. They have a beautiful love for each other. And then there is the first sign or a first sort of betrayal that happens. Erin wins this big essay contest, and Genevieve finds out what the essay was about. Can you tell us about that moment?
Sure. So, for context in the book, Erin writes this essay, Land of Opportunity, and it gets published kind of outside of her control, right? She thought she was just doing a writing exercise, and her professor is like, "This is great. Let's submit it for this competition," and doesn't ask her. And so it becomes this huge accidental betrayal because when Genevieve reads it, it's at the same time as the rest of the world reading it. And she's so shocked. She's like, "What is this? What is this part of your mind and your consciousness I have no access to?" And that I feel a little bit betrayed by, honestly. And I think that can happen when you're so close to somebody that you almost over identify with them and you're kind of shocked when you realize they have this whole other life. And so they try to navigate their way through that by almost like not speaking about it, but it becomes the first big secret they have in between them that's an open secret. You know, that sense of profound discomfort where you know and I know, but we both don't want to talk about it because we want to preserve the relationship we have, but we already know something has changed. And so that moment was very heartbreaking for me to write, actually, and follows the recurring theme I have going myself of like having random bits of paper in the book, I guess, because the essay is on a piece of paper. Yeah,
So, what is the content of that essay that is so hurtful?
it's heartfelt. Erin just writes about what it feels like to have been put into a different family, and she's just telling in the essay sincerely what she feels, which is that she's all alone. It's it's tough, and this is true. It is true. She is all alone. But then Genevieve is like, "What? You're what? Okay, so am I like, what am I gonna do with my new powers of invisibility? Like, oh right, I guess I don't exist then." So it's like the kind of thing you as an adult you read it and you understand why they both feel that way. But as a child, at that age, they're quite young when they go through that. You're a little more myopic and your feelings are they're very overwhelming. And so when she reads that, she feels just totally betrayed and trying to regulate unsuccessfully.
So this betrayal between the two sisters the first time with the essay contest is one sort of small or large betrayal, depending on how you look at it. And there are many, many points throughout the book where one sister feels betrayed by the other. And then at a later one, you talk about this and they admit to each other how much they need each other. And we really see this love, this deep bond. Could you read for us so we can talk about this a little bit more?
Sure. So I'll just read from a scene where they're talking about their future plans. And already their paths have kind of diverged. She stared at me calculating, as if she had been restraining herself for a long time. Then she blurted, "Are you gonna work in the ice cream shop forever?" I was stung. "Well, no. I'm still figuring out my next steps." "It's not too late. Why don't you sit for the A levels again?" I burst out laughing. "The exams are in 2 months." She slid into bed, turned her back to me, and refused to speak. I stopped laughing. "Are you throwing a tantrum?" I asked, incredulous. I walked my fingers over to her side of the bed and up her spine, tapping her nape. When she didn't move, I put aside the ice cream and flipped her over. Her cheeks were wet. Erin covered her face with both hands and mumbled, "Without you, I don't know what to do." My annoyance evaporated. Did she feel like I had abandoned her? Hollowly, I said, but you're doing well." "Am I?" "I know what it's like, but you have to keep going. Once you get there, you can start to breathe."
This passage for me was so powerful, especially the part where Erin says to her sister, "Without you, I don't know what to do." And that's because at this point in the book, there's a small betrayal again, which is their paths are diverging in school. So Erin is being very successful. She's doing well, and Jen is not. Jen is totally flunked in her own mind, right? She's flailing. She's working in an ice cream shop, and Erin is just rising, rising, rising. And this moment for the sisters is so touching because all along they've been bonded and together, but now they're really diverging. What's next? So, can you talk about this moment where they realize maybe they're not on the same path anymore?
Yeah, I think their hearts are broken because they want to stay together. I think at that age, or like at any point in life, people are resistant to change, especially when you have a relationship that you hold on to so tightly. And so I think there is a double thing going on where on the surface, they don't want to separate. They want to be together forever. But on the like underneath it, I think they are frustrated at themselves for not being able to be generous enough with the other person to let the other person fly. So when I was creating Genevieve's character in this moment, I was just thinking to myself, what would it be like to kind of suspect that the other person is holding themselves back for you? And for Aaron, what would it be like to feel like you could never fully stretch your arms or stretch your wings because of how it might hurt somebody around you? And then so it comes back to this idea of suffocation, because as an artist, I am really interested in this concept of suffocation. Like, what would it be like to put extreme pressure on anything, on a relationship, on a household, on a country, or on a system? And this was the answer to that. There are great emotional fractures and costs that come to that kind of suffocation of not having the space to be your own person. And with regards to your question on the school system, we have a really intense school system. And I think they are trying to change that. They are trying to make it kinder, like, somebody growing up in Singapore or growing up in any kind of like high pressure system. This requires deep systemic change and not just telling people to sleep more often, because everybody has to do it. Otherwise, you just fall behind.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Jemima Way, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Jemima Way's brand new debut novel, The Original Daughter. Jemima, we're just starting to talk about the school system in Singapore. This is one of the big themes that we cover in this book, The Original Daughter. And another piece that sort of comes off of that is ambition. Jen and Aaron, your two main characters, are very ambitious. That idea just seems to come up again and again. Can you talk about their ambition and why you put ambition so deeply into the novel?
Yeah, there are two girls who grew up as dreamers. So one of the big themes in the book when I was starting to create it was this idea of daydreaming, something that's totally inefficient and not pragmatic, but that we need because we have souls and we have dignity and we have imagination. And so these two girls, they dream together, they craft this life together. They're almost co-authoring this imagined future for themselves. And as they're trying to catch up to that version of themselves, I think they have to confront their own personal feelings and the fact that our lived reality doesn't always align with all the dreams and hopes we have for ourselves. And I think this is something that's generational, that repeats through the book and through the lives of people we know, right? Everybody hopes for things and then kind of doesn't fall short. So this idea of failing upwards is something I'm really interested in. And I think that's one of the big first heartbreaks that anybody experiences in the world. Just this great desire to thrive and not just survive. And yet being unable to do anything but paddle furiously trying to breathe.
And you really write about it beautifully. And you take us into the moment when Jen's heart is really broken because a teacher pulls her aside and says, maybe this isn't your path. This was so heartbreaking to me. Would you read this for us?
Okay. At the end of my first year, I was pulled to a side by a concerned teacher and given a form, printed on official-looking paper, a sickly shade of green. Not everyone is suited for academia, the teacher said, as I scanned the paper. It was a withdrawal form. But I am, I protested, citing all the A's that characterized my schooling life thus far, only to be met with a look of incredulity. Was I really offering as my defense the petty achievements of a child? Just think about it, the teacher said. Only 3 in 10 students nationwide make it to the next stage, all the way to the university. You know you're graded against a bell curve for the A levels, which means you can't just be good, you have to be better than. And right now, you're kibble for your peers. Are you expelling me? The teacher chose her words carefully. No one can make you withdraw.
Oh my God. And this happened to you in real life?
Yeah, gosh, isn't it crazy? So basically, I must have suppressed it forever because I only recently started thinking about it again, but this actually did happen because I was what you call a direct school admissions student, which means I sang my way into school. I didn't get into my school through my grades, I got in through my voice. And so I think there is a little bit of stigma around that. Like we can't study, we're just good at singing. But that's not true. I studied really hard. And so this teacher was like, I don't think this is for you. And I was like, you are wrong, actually. Yeah, so even though Genevieve's experience resulted in heartbreak, I just got really petty. I was like, no, you are wrong. That's fine. And so I did really well on my next series of tests. And he came up to me again and he was like, did you copy from somebody? And I was like, this is something you hear about, thinking that's not realistic. Nobody would say that. That's mean. And then when it happens to you, you're like, oh, you are a caricature. That is why they call it caricature, because people do that. This is deranged behavior. Anyway, he was wrong because I have a book out now. So clearly. I did not copy from my literature exam. Anyway, whatever. So that was just my little villain origin story.
I'm sorry that happened to you, and I was so sorry to read it in this book when it happens to Jen, and she wasn't quite as energized maybe as you, but she doesn't drop out either. She says, "I'm gonna keep going, I'm gonna keep trying." But then sort of a little bit further down, we see her actually deciding she's going to take herself out of the pool, and she goes to New Zealand, and she says, "Maybe I'll have an easier time of it here." Can you tell us about that decision and what drove her to New Zealand?
I think something that's really common. Singapore is a small country, right? We are a city state. So in America, you can grow up in a city and be like, I want to go to the countryside. I want to go to the, somewhere different. We don't have that. You go far enough, you end up in the ocean. And so you for her, there is this great sense of like the Singaporean abroad, the Singaporean who wants to leave Singapore and come home later or not come home later. And this is extremely common, and I did want to have that in the book, this sense of somebody leaving. And the reasons you leave are like, how many reasons are there to leave? One, you're leaving for school. Two, you're leaving because you can afford to migrate. And three, you're leaving because you're running away. And so for her, her options are becoming extremely limited. So somebody tells her, what are the inherent privileges of your nationality and your passport? You have freedom of travel. As a Singaporean, we have one of the most powerful passports in the world. She's like, all right, I'm taking myself out of this pool. I'm tired of this comparison. I'm going. Again, this is one of those things you think you have full control over, but a lot of it is machinations outside of your control, right? Singapore is a primarily English-speaking country. Our language of education, our language of administration is English. And so that opens a lot of doors for us in terms of where you feel comfortable. And so she thinks to herself, regionally, I don't want to go to America, that's too far. Regionally, where can I go where I speak the language? I would be considered very efficient. Singaporeans have a reputation for being extremely hard workers, extremely high achievers. She kind of plays on that. She really uses that narrative and gets herself a job in New Zealand. And she's like, bye, I'm out of here. And that is like a breath of fresh air for her because she gets to leave. It's the first time, I think, that in the book that we see her totally alone, which means a lot to her.
Except when she gets to New Zealand, she has a bad experience one day, and it's something that really affects her, really throws her off. Can you tell us about this experience, what she encounters?
No, I mean, it's not just one experience. I think she gets to New Zealand and she realizes that just because you leave one place doesn't make everything else ideal. And you still have to deal with the daily frictions of living now as a foreigner and now as an outsider in a new place. And partially, I feel like that should open up a path for her to be more empathetic to Erin. Unfortunately, she's young and a little too in her own head, so it does not. So one day when she's walking in bright daylight, fully clothed, she gets attacked on the streets by a young boy. And so this really throws her because it goes against every narrative you've ever heard about what it means to be assaulted, what assault feels more legitimate than others. And so she then has to work through all these internalized narratives of whether or not it's legitimate enough for her to feel this much trauma. And it causes her to make great decisions that she regrets because then she leans on somebody for support who she kind of regrets leaning on later, but who she has no real choice if you think about it because she has nobody in New Zealand, not a single person who understands her, and not that many young people. Like the part of New Zealand she moves to, it's not that happening. I actually did a research trip to New Zealand when I knew that there would be a big part of my novel set there. I saved up and went for a trip there, and I was like, where are all the young people? So I asked somebody in a cafe, I was like, where are the young people? And she was like, I don't know, you tell me. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I fed all of that into creating this sense of moving to a new country, looking around and just being able to relate to absolutely nobody.
So we see Jen, she is in New Zealand. She's basically alone and she is attacked on the street, assaulted. And her sister, Erin, she's becoming a host. She's earning money. She's doing well in school. And she seems to drop everything to come see Jen and try to take care of her. And this leads to really the big betrayal where we see that she channels her sister's feelings and what she's going through into her first role, into her first movie. And so Jen is asking, and me, the reader, I'm asking, did Erin steal from her sister? Was it a betrayal, or was she actually there to help her sister through it? How did you think about that betrayal and what happened?
I think this is a yes and situation. I think more than one thing can be true. And I think if you read the book up to this point, you can understand why Erin would think that this is her one big break. Because if she fails at this first role, that's it for her. Nobody's going to hire her again. It does feel like this could change everything. And so I do think that when you're in a situation like that, you take whatever you can. You make the choices you can to survive. But then there are certain costs. And I do think that, I mean, dude, I journaled so much through the different characters' perspectives, trying to figure out what exactly was going through their head as they came to this decision. I was trying so hard to get them to figure it out. And I still think that the thing about art is that it grows out of an excess, like an unquantifiable excess of experience. And so even though I could list like a dozen reasons that go either way for this reasoning or that, I do think that there is something beyond that that was happening with Erin's decision, where she wants so badly to be forgiven and to be shown the same generosity she feels that she has shown to her sister her whole life. So is there right and wrong? I don't know. I don't think so. It's interesting because in so many conversations around the book, this has come up so often. People can't decide. They just don't know which sister was in the right. But I think that that's life, you know? People are not so black and white where you have somebody, this is a bad person, this is a good person. People are more varied than that. And I think part of living, part of negotiating and maintaining and sustaining and nourishing relationships is being able to have that flexibility to see people beyond what they're like in this exact moment.
I really think that's one of the strengths of the book is that, again and again with these so-called betrayals, I kept asking, was it a betrayal? And which sister was right? And I never really came to an answer. And I could see it from both sides. And I just wanted them to both say, I'm so sorry, and hug each other and be okay. There's a quiet theme in this book. We really see it expressed with the character of the father, and that's depression. Jemima, can we talk about that? Tell us about that theme, that quiet thread throughout the book of depression.
It's one of the smaller themes, is this idea of like depression in men as they age, which is something the dad in the book really deals with. He is left behind by the way society has progressed, and he wants to be there for his family. I think that's something all the characters in my book share. They want and they want and they want, and they are almost handicapped by their inability to meet that want. And a lot of this want is not a selfish one, it's a want to be there for somebody else and how we feel. Because that is something I'm artistically interested in. I'm less interested in this idea of walking away from a relationship that doesn't serve you. I'm more interested in how do we hold on, what can love endure? What can we hold on? How can we hold on to difficult people or endure those relationships or see or evaluate them fairly instead of deciding very early on at the first sign of friction to walk. You know, it's interesting because there isn't any reported statistics on homelessness really that's like official in Singapore, but there are people who decide to become homeless because they leave and they don't want to report it. And so that is something that happens with the dad. He really wants to be the best dad possible, but he's still dealing with his own unprocessed trauma. He wakes up one day and he can't quite understand how his life has gotten here. I think the one thing we can't go is back. And so that is like working with time, wrestling with time was a huge, huge thing in this book as I work forward with the mom and dad and the grandmother. Just this idea that the time we have is the time we have. Everything else you can kind of like remedy in some way, but you cannot get back time that you've already spent. And that realization for both the mom and dad hits them in such different ways.
Jemima, I want to ask you about Singapore itself. The country has seemed to change so quickly in the pages of this book, even just in the short lifespan of your characters, Jen and Aaron. Can you talk about that rate of change and progress in Singapore?
Yeah, Singapore is a country that's very predicated on progress and change, and you can almost get whiplash from the way things have changed. I think that that does something to a person. I can understand why that happens, but I really wanted to document that because so many things my parents tell me of their childhood, they can't point to. It's something different now. When I look at 1 square foot of Singapore, I can see 5 different versions of it within my lifespan. And the shop house where I work my first job is now a boutique hotel. The school I used to attend doesn't exist anymore, and I'm young. So for my parents' generation, for their parents' generation, it's so disconcerting to think of a Singapore that's like a ghost of a Singapore superimposed over the country that we have now. And part of writing this book to me was like almost like a furious documentation of a country that's changing so rapidly and so quickly. It was really important for me to immortalize that world in print so that I could point to it and be like, we were here, we existed. this was a version of the country that existed. And let me tell you, because I took so long to write this book, when I started writing it, it was so contemporary, and now people are like, how was it like to write a historical novel? Which is so horrifying to me. I had to do so much research and fact checking that just things changed so quickly that I had to make sure everything corresponded with the dates in the book. Doing that research really clarified for me how quickly our country has changed because I know it, but when I have to fact check it, it's kind of shocking.
I want to stick with this idea of a love letter to Singapore and specifically the Singapore that you know and love. There are also lots of little flashes of nature and flowers that you weave throughout this novel. The original daughter, Jemima, tell us about that.
So Singapore is known as the Garden City. We have a really strong image as one that's very green. And it's true. If you come to Singapore, we have like great parks. Our airport has like the world's largest indoor waterfall, which is surrounded by this huge 4-story, 22,000 square foot forest sponsored by Shiseido. And we import a lot of plants, and it's a big part of our national identity. But I do think that our relationship to nature is something that there is a different relationship to nature that we have that's a more local relationship that doesn't make it to the media. So that's why I had all these little moments of the girls as kids picking flowers from the bushes, drinking the nectar from the middle of the Nizora flower. It's something that a lot of kids do when they're young. And I do think that this is not limited to Singapore. I do think children of every culture and every nationality have a secret language with the country they live in. They have a connection to the home that they have, that like I mean the physical home, the physical like the soil, the plants that we kind of forget as we get older. And that language for these girls was like the plucking of the flower, the kind of like almost desecration of these flowers, drinking the nectar and dumping them on the floor. It's something that I think we don't see as often anymore. Every time I go back to Singapore, I see less and less of these flowers. The changing local landscape of flora and fauna is something that I track through my life. And I think to a certain extent through the book.
My guest today is Jemima Wei. We're talking about her brand new debut novel, The Original Daughter. I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We were just talking about this notion of betrayal and wanting the sisters, Jen and Aaron, the two main characters, to hug it out and not really being sure who's right, who's wrong, what's it all about. And I understand that when you are writing, you write something called an emotional synopsis between drafts. And I can see that playing in, with these sisters and their relationships. Can you talk about that? What is an emotional synopsis?
Yeah, I adapted that from craft exercise in Matt Bell's Refuse to Be Done. So as I was revising this book, I read like a ton of craft books, trying to, get this book into its final shape. And in his exercise, you write down all the plot points and revise that to tighten the plot holes. And I was like, well, that makes sense. But I think for my book, it makes more sense to do that on an emotional level because so much of the character work is emotional. It happens beneath the surface. And so in between each draft, I write this full emotional synopsis where I'm tracing each character almost as a roaming POV. I'm tracing each character and their psychological motivations, how they react to each other, the things that push them, the things that trigger them, the things that they really want to aspire towards but cannot quite do. And then that turns out to be about 5 to 8,000 words between each draft. And then I tighten that. I look for gaps in their emotional logic and I just fill it in, or I cut it and I pull it together. And then I have a bird's eye view. Then quite easily identify where characters kind of like are struggling, not where they are struggling, but where the writing is struggling with trying to fully realize a part of a character. Because it's important to me for the characters' struggle to feel like they are struggling with something, even if it's not something the reader will agree with. I think the characters can be very frustrating. I was often very frustrated when I was working these characters, but it has to be a frustration that's born of what is happening narratively and not a frustration because you don't understand why this doesn't feel like a fully realized character. It has to be something that is born out of the fact that these are frustrating people and people are frustrating.
You brought up Matthew Bell's book, Refuse to Be Done. It is such a good book. I highly recommend that to any listeners who are working on their novels. Jemima, I understand you also write your goals for each draft. So, how many drafts do you have, and what kind of goals are those?
How many drafts I have is like a depressing question. Like too many, honestly, because I was working on this book for 9 years before I finished the draft I queried my agent with. And then I worked on it for another 2 years. So by the time it comes out, it would have been 11 years. So I don't have an answer to how many drafts, just like infinite number of drafts, I guess. But in terms of goals, as I was revising the book, this was after I finished my first draft and was working on second, third, fourth draft. I was thinking to myself, how do I make this book better? But I wanted to do everything at once. I wanted the characters to be better, but I wanted the book to be tighter. I wanted to expand in this direction but contract in another direction. But a draft cannot serve two gods. You don't have to limit yourself to doing everything in one draft. Just tell yourself, this draft, I'm going to make it tighter. This draft, I'm going to explore this part of the book that is underexplored. And so it feels a little bit like the book is breathing. It goes in and out, in and out. And you can do that if you tell yourself that you will sit for as long as it takes to get the book to its perfect form. I think the thing that really restricted me at the start was thinking I had to finish it ASAP. But when I thought to myself, I would not put out a book I'm not happy with. So if it's going to take 50 more drafts, we will do 50 more drafts. And I was like, all right, then it kind of freed me up to really work towards specific goals in one draft, put it aside, and work towards specific goals in another draft.
Jemima Wei, we are talking about your brand new debut, The Original Daughter. It took you 11 years to write this book, to get it published, to get it out. And you've said that your entire career leading up to this has been an attempt to fund your writing life. I love that. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think for writers, money really means money to buy writing time. So I was a freelancer for many, many years. So I worked in an office in advertising for 3 years, and then I switched to doing freelance. And so as a freelancer, I would just work these insane hours thinking to myself, I have this future goal of maybe moving to the States, doing a PhD. At the time, I didn't know what an MFA was. So I thought, okay, to be a writer, you go to the States or the UK, maybe do a PhD and write on the side and try to find somebody to publish a book. And so because I had this huge goal in the future, which I knew would cost a lot of money, all I did was like work really hard and save money. For years and years and years, I would just be saving, saving, saving. And I had like this writing fund, because the thing that I think people don't talk about a lot is that writing is expensive. You submit to journals, it costs money. Submit to competitions, it costs money. You apply to an MFA, it's like a couple $100. It really adds up. And I feel like I didn't want that part of my life to feel restricted in that way, because so much else of my life felt restricted by my financial limitations. And so I would put side money into this writing fund, and I would just tell myself, anything that's writing, I'm just going to close one eye and it's going to come out of that fund. And so that allowed me the psychological freedom to apply for competitions and to submit to journals that I would otherwise be like, do I want to pay $16 to submit to this thing in American dollars, which is like 20 Singapore dollars? I would do the conversion in my head. Once I put aside that money, I was like, no, it's going to my writing. All of this is an investment in my writing life. And that was very helpful for me.
What advice do you have for new writers?
Keep writing, because the thing is, you can't have a book or a finished product if you don't actually write. And so writing is really important. I would say make friends, because it's a crazy and lonely world. And pragmatically, I think you should lift weights, because you sit for a long time. It's bad for your back, and you need good back muscles. Otherwise, you will mess up your spine. And so I think ergonomics are very important. And I strongly suggest working on that.
Oh my God, that's the best advice I've heard.
Oh, really?
I can honestly say I've never heard that.
Really? I'm so happy to surprise you, given that you talk to many writers. All writers, we just aspire towards one original thought, and I feel like I got that here. Thank you.
Jemima Wei, this was so much fun. Thank you so much for joining me today on Check This Out.
Oh, thank you.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna. You've been listening to Check This Out, where we dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. This conversation is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the Penn-Faulkner Foundation. Penn-Faulkner administers major literary awards and public programs, including the Penn-Faulkner Award for Fiction. Next week, a conversation with Emma Patty, author of Tilt. Tune in next week for that interview. Our producer today is Jessica Hunt. Penn-Faulkner's executive director is Gwydion Sullivan. NHPR's program director is Emily Quirk. The show is sponsored by CNS Wholesale Grocers Family of Companies, the podcast Totally Booked with Sibby, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, and the Howe Library Corporation. Remember to go to your local library or local bookstore and check out all of the books you hear about here and love. Thanks for listening. See you next time.